Martin Hewitt, Investigator, by Arthur Morrison. 3. The Case of Mr. Foggatt. Almost the only dogmatism that Martin Hewitt permitted himself in regards to his professional methods was one of the matter of accumulative probabilities. Often when I have remarked upon the apparent trivial nature of the clues by which he allowed himself to be guided, sometimes to all seeming in the very face of all likelihood, he has replied that two trivialities pointing in the same direction became at once, by their mere agreement, no trivialities at all, but the enormous important consideration. If I were to search for a man, he would say, of whom I knew nothing, but he squinted and bore a birthmark on his right hand, and limped, and I observed a man who answered to the first peculiarity so far as clue would be trivial, because thousands of men squint. Now, if that man presently moved to an exhibition of a birthmark on his right hand, the value of that squint and that mark would increase at 100 to 1,000-fold. Apart they're little, together much. The weight of evidence is not doubled merely, it would only be doubled. If half the men who squinted had right-hand birthmarks, whereas this proportion, if it were ascertained, would be perhaps more like 1 in 1,000, the two trivialities pointing in the same direction become very strong evidence. And when the man is seen to walk with a limp, that limp, another triviality, reinforcing the others, brings the matter to the rank of a particularly certainty. The Bertillon systems of identification, what is but a smart summary of trivialities. Thousands of men are of the same height. Thousands of men are of the same foot. Thousands of the same girth of head. Thousands correspond with any separate measurements you may name. It is when the measurements are taken together that you have your man identified forever. Just consider how few, if any, of your friends correspond to exactly any two personal particularities. Hewitt's dogma received its illustration unexpectedly close at home. The old house wherein my chambers and Hewitt's office were situated contained, besides my own, 2 or 3 more bachelor dens, in addition to the offices on the ground of the first and second floors. At the very top of it all, at the back, a fat middle-aged man named Foggatt occupied a set of 4 rooms. It was only after a long residence, by an accidental remark of the housekeeper's, that I learned the man's name, which is not painted on the door or displayed with all the others on the wall of the ground floor porch. Mr. Foggatt appeared to have few friends, but lived in something as nearly approachable luxury as an old bachelor in chambers can live. An ascending case of champagne was a common phenomenon on the staircase, and I have more than once seen a picture destined for the top floor, of a sort that went far to awaken green consciousness in the heart of a poor journalist. The man himself was not altogether prepossessing. Fat as he was, he had a way of carrying his head forward on his extended neck and gazing widely about with a pair of eyes, the roundest and most prominent eyes I can remember having seen, except in a fish. On the whole, his appearance was rather vulgar, rather arrogant, and rather suspicious, without any very pronounced quality of any sort. But certainly he was not pretty. In the end, however, he was found shot dead in his sitting room. It was in this way Hewitt and I had dined together at my club, and late in the evening had returned to my rooms to smoke and discuss whatever came uppermost. I had made a bargain that day of 2 speculative odd looks at a book sale, each of which contained a hidden prize. We sat talking and turning over these books while time went unperceived, when suddenly we were startled by the sound of a loud report. Clearly it was in the building. We listened for a moment, but we heard nothing else, and then Hewitt expressed his opinion that the report was that of a gunshot. Gunshots in residential chambers are not common things. Therefore, I got up and went to the landing, looking up the stairs and down. At the top of the next flat, I saw Mrs. Clayton, the housekeeper. She appeared to be frightened and told me that the report came from Mr. Foggatt's room. She thought he might have had an accident with a pistol that usually lay on his mantelpiece. We went upstairs with her, and she knocked at Mr. Foggatt's door. There was no reply. Through the ventilation fanlight over the door, it could be seen that there were lights within, a sign, Miss Clayton maintained, that Mr. Foggatt was not out. We knocked again, very much more loudly, and called, but still ineffectively. The door was locked, and an application of the housekeeper's key proved that the tenant's key had been left inside the locks. Mrs. Clayton, convinced that something had happened, became distressing, and in the end Hewitt pried the door open with a small poker. Something had happened. In the sitting room, Mr. Foggatt sat with his head bowed over the table, quiet and still. The head was ill to look at, and by it lay a large revolver of the full-sized army pattern. Mrs. Clayton ran back down towards the landing with faint screams. "Run, Brett!" said Hewitt. "Doctor and a policeman." I bounded first down the stairs after half a flight of time. First I thought, a doctor. He may not be dead. I could think of no doctor in the immediate neighborhood, but ran up the streets away from the Strand. And as being the more likely direction of the doctor, although less to go for a policeman, it took me a good 5 minutes to find the medico, after being led astray by a red lamp and the private hotel. Another 5 to get back with the policeman. Foggatt was dead, without a doubt. Probably had shot himself, the doctor thought, from the powder blackening and the other circumstances. Certainly nobody could have left the room by the door, or he must have passed my landing, while the fact that the door being found locked from the inside made the other things impossible. There were 2 windows to the room, both of which were shut, one being fastened by the latch, while the catch of the other was broken, and old or fractured. Below those windows was a sheer drop of 50 feet, or more without a foot or handhold near. The windows in the other room were shut and fastened. Certainly it seemed suicide, unless it were one of those accidents that would occur to people who fiddle ignorantly with firearms. Soon the rooms were in the possession of the police, and we turned out. We looked at the housekeeper's kitchen, where her daughter was reviving and calming Mrs. Clayton with gin and water. "You must upset yourself, Mrs. Clayton," Hewitt said, "or what will become of us all? The doctor thinks it was an accident." He took a small bottle from the sewing machine of oil from his pocket and handed it to the daughter, thanking her for the loan. There was little evidence at the inquest. The shot had been heard and nobody had been found. That was the practical sum of the matter. No friends or relatives of the dead men came forward. The doctor gave his opinion as to the probability of suicide or an accident. The police evidence tended to the same direction. Nothing had been found to indicate any other person had been near the dead man's rooms on the night of the fatality. On the other hand, his papers, bank book, etc. proved him to be a man of considerable substance, with no apparent motive for suicide. The police had been unable to trace any relatives, or indeed any nearer connections than casual acquaintances, fellow clubmen, and so on. The jury found that Mr. Foggatt had died by accident. "Well, Brett," he asked me afterwards, "what do you think of the verdict?" I said that it seemed to be the most reasonable, plausible one, and to square the common-sense view of the case. "Yes," he replied, "perhaps it does. From the point of view of the jury, and on their information, the verdict was quite reasonable. Nevertheless, Mr. Foggatt did not shoot himself. He was shot by a rather tall and active young man, perhaps a sailor, or certainly a gymnast, a young man who I think I could identify if I saw him." "But how do you know this?" "By the simplest possible inferences, which you may easily guess if you but think." "But then why didn't you say this at the inquest?" My dear fellow, they don't want my inferences or conjectures at an inquest. They only want evidence. If I had traced the murder, of course, then I should have communicated with the police. As a matter of fact, it is quite possible that the police have observed and know as much as I do, or more. They don't give everything away at an inquest, you know. It wouldn't do. But if you were right, how did the man get away? Come, we're near home now. Let's take a look at the back of the house. He couldn't have left Mr. Foggatt's landing door, as we know. And he was there, I'm certain of that. And as the chimney is out of the question, there was a good fire in the grate. But he must have gone out by the window. Only one window is possible, the one with a broken catch, for all the others were fastened inside. Out of that window, then, he went. But how? The window is 50 feet up. Of course it is. But why will you persist on assuming that that is the only way to escape if the window is downward? You see, look up there. The window is at the top floor. It was very broad sill. Over the window is nothing but the flat-faced gable end, but to the right, and a foot or two above the level of the top of the window, an iron gutter extends. Otherwise, it is not a lead composition, but a very strong iron gutter, supported just at its end by an iron bracket. If a tall man stood on the end of the windowsill, steadying himself by the left hand and leaning to the right, he could touch the end of it, this gutter, with his right hand. The full stretch, toe to finger, is 7 foot 3 inches. I have measured it. An active gymnast or sailor could draw the gutter with a slight spring, and then by its drawing himself onto the roof. You say he will be very active, dexterous, and cool. So he would. And that very fact helps us, because it narrows the field of inquiry. We know what sort of man to look for, because being certain, as I am, that the man was in the room, I know that he left that way that I am telling you. Must have left in some way, and all other ways being impossible, this only remains difficult to defeat, as it may seem. The fact of his shutting the window behind him further proves his coolness, and address is so great a height from the ground. All this was very plain, but the main point was so dark. You say you know that another man was in the room, I said. How do you know? As I've said, by an obvious inference. Come now, you shall guess how I arrived at the inference. You often speak of your interest in my work, and the attention with which you follow it. This shall be a simple exercise for you. You saw everything in the room as plainly as I myself. Bring the scene back to your memory, and think over the various small objects littering about and how they would affect the case. Quick observation is the first essential to my work. Did you see the newspaper, for instance? Yes, there was an evening paper on the floor, but I didn't examine it. Anything else? On the table there was a whiskey decanter taken from the Tantalus stand on the sideboard and one glass. That, by the by, I added, looked as though only one person were present. So it did. Perhaps all the inference wouldn't be very strong. Go on. There was a fruit stand on the sideboard with a plate beside it, containing a few nutshells, a piece of apple, a pair of nutcrackers, and, I think, some orange peel. There was, of course, all ordinary furniture, but no chair pulled up to the table except that used by Mr. Foggatt himself. That's all I noticed, I think. Say, there was an ashtray on the table, and a partly burned cigar near it. Only one cigar, though. Excellent, excellent. Indeed, as far as the memory's simple observation go, you saw everything plainly, and you remember everything. Surely now you know how I found out the other man had just left. No, I don't. Unless there was different kind of ash in the ashtray. That is a fairly good suggestion, but there was not. There was only a single ash, corresponding to every way in that cigar. Don't you remember anything that did as we went downstairs? You returned the bottle of oil to the housekeeper's daughter, I think. I did. Doesn't that give you a hint? Come, surely you have it by now. I haven't. Then I shall tell you. You don't deserve it. Think, and don't mention the subject again until you have at least one guess to make. The thing stares you in the face. You see it. You remember it. And yet you won't see it. I won't encourage your slovenliness to my thoughts, my boy, by telling you what you can know for yourself if you like. Goodbye. I'm off now. There's a case in hand, and I can't neglect it. Don't you propose to go further into this, then? Hewitt shrugged his shoulders. I'm not a policeman, he said. The case is very good hands. Of course, if anybody comes to me, I will, as a matter of business, take it up. It's very interesting, but I can't neglect my regular work for it. Naturally, I shall keep my eyes upon it and memory in order. Sometimes these things come into hands by themselves, as it were. In that case, of course, I am a loyal citizen and ready to help the law. Au revoir. I am a busy man myself, and thought little more of Hewitt's conundrum for some time. Indeed, when I did think, I saw no way to answer. A week after the inquest, I took a holiday. I had written my nightly leaders regularly every day the rest of the 5 years, and saw no more of Hewitt for 6 weeks. After I returned, with still a few days of leave left to run, one evening we together turned into the Luzanni's off Coventry Street for dinner. I've been here several times lately, Hewitt said. They feed me very well. No, not that table. He seized my arm, and I turned to an unoccupied corner. It's fancy and draughty. He led the way to a longer table where a dark, lithe, and, as always could be seen, tall young man already sat. We took chairs opposite of him. We had scarcely seated ourselves before Hewitt broke into a torrent of conversation on the subject of bicycling. As our previous conversation had been of a literary sort, and I had never known Hewitt to any other show of any slightest of interest in bicycling, this rather surprised me. I had, however, such a general outsider's grasp of the subject, as is usual for the journalist of all work, and managed to keep the talk going from my side. As we went on, I could see the face of the young man opposite brighten with interest. He was a rather fine-looking fellow with a dark, though very clear skin, but had a hard, angry look of the eye, a prominence of the cheekbone, and a squareness of jaw that gave him a rather uninviting aspect. As Hewitt rattled on, however, our neighbor's expression became one of pleasant interest merely. Of course, Hewitt said, we have a number of the very capital men just now, but I believe a deal of the forgotten riders of 5, 10, and 15 yards back. Osmond, I believe, was better than any man riding now, and I think it would be a puzzle some of them to beat Frindelwall, as he was the best. But poor old Quartus, really, I believe he was as good as anybody. Nobody ever beat Quartus, except, let me see, I think it was somebody beat Quartus once. Who was it now? I can't remember. Lyles, said the young man opposite us, looking up quickly. Ah, yes, Lyles it was. Charles Lyles. Wasn't he in the championship? Well, championship. 1880. Quartus won with the other 3, though. Yes, so he did. I saw Quartus when he first broke the old 4.46 mile record. And straight away, he had plunged into a whirl of talk of bicycles, tricycles, recording, racing cyclists, Hillier and Semner and Noah Whitling, Taylorson and Appleyard. Talk wherein the young man opposite bore an animated share, while I was somewhat left in the cold. A new friend, it seemed, had himself been a prominent racing bicyclist for a few years back, and was presently, at Hewitt's request, exhibiting a neat gold medal that hung at his watch guard. That was one, he explained, in an old tall bicycle days, the days of bad tracks when every racing cyclist carried cinder scars on his face from the numerous accidents. He pointed to the blue mark on his forehead, which, he told us, was a track scar, and described a bad fall he had cost him his teeth and broken others. The gaps among the teeth were plain to see as he smiled. Presently, the waiter brought desserts. The young man opposite took an apple, nutcrackers, and a fruit knife lay at our side by side, and Hewitt returned to the stand to offer him the knife. "No thanks," he said. "I only polish a good apple, never peel it. It's a mistake, except one thick-skinned foreign ones." And he began to munch the apple as only a boy or healthy athlete can. Presently he turned his head to order coffee. The waiter's back was turned, and he had been called twice. To my unutterable amazement, Hewitt reached swiftly across the table, snatched the half-eaten apple from the young man's plate, and pocketed it, gazing immediately with an abstracted air at the painted Cupid on the ceiling. Our neighbor turned again, looked doubtfully at his plate and tablecloth about, and then shot a keen glance in the direction of Hewitt. He said nothing, however, but took his coffee and his bill, and deliberately drank the former, gazing quietly at Hewitt as he did, paid the latter, then left. Immediately Hewitt was at his feet and taking an umbrella which stood near, and followed. Just as he reached the door, he met our late neighbor, who had turned suddenly back. "Your umbrella, I think?" Hewitt asked, offering. "Yes, thanks." But the man's eyes had more than his former hardiness, and his jaw muscles tightened as I looked. He turned and went. Hewitt came back to me. "Pay the bill," he said. "Go back to your rooms. I will come on later. I must follow this man. It's the Foggatt case." As he went out, I heard a cab rattle away, and immediately after it another. I paid the bill and went home. It was 10 o'clock before Hewitt turned up, calling in at his office below on the way as he came up to me. "Mr. Sidney Mason," he said, "is the gentleman the police will be waiting for tomorrow. I expect for the Foggatt murder. He is a smart man, as I remember ever meeting, and he has done me rather nearly twice this evening." "You mean the man we sat opposite Luzetti's, of course?" "Yes, I got his name, of course, and for the reverse of the gold medal, he was good enough to show me. But I fear he has bilked me over the address. He suspected me, and that was plain. And he left his umbrella by the way of experimenting, to see if I was watching him more sharply than to notice his circumstance, and to avail myself of it to follow him. I was hasty and fell into the trap. He cabbed away from Luzetti's, and I cabbed away after him. He has led a pretty dance up to down London tonight, and 2 cabbies have made quite a stroke of business out of us. In the end he entered a house of which, of course, I've taken the address, but I don't expect that he lives there. He is too smart a man to lead me to his den, but the police can certainly find something of him in the house he went in at, and I expect the way back. By the way, you never guessed the simple little puzzle to which I found that was the murderer, did you?" "Yes, you see it now, of course." "Something to do with the apple, I suppose?" "Something to do with it. I should think so. You are worthy innocent. Just ring your bell. Will tomorrow Mr. Clayton's sewing machine oil again? On the night we broke into Foggatt's, you saw the nutshells and the bitten remains of an apple on the sideboard, and you remembered it. And yet you couldn't see that the piece of apple possibly lay an important piece of evidence. Of course, I never expected you to have arrived at the conclusion, as I had, because I had 10 minutes in which to examine the apple, and to do what I did with it. But at least you should have seen the possibility of evidence in it. First, now, the apple was white. A bitten apple, you must have observed, turns a reddish-brown color if left to stand long. Different kinds of apples brown with different rapidities, and this browning always begins at the core. This is one of the 20,000 tiny things that few people take trouble to notice, but it is most useful for the man in my position to know. A russet will brown quite quickly. The apple on the sideboard was, near as I could tell, a Newtown pippin or other apple of that kind, which will brown at the core from 20 minutes to half an hour. In other parts of the quarter of the hour more. When we saw it, it was white, with barely a tinge of brown about the exposed core. Inference somebody had been eating it. 15 or 20 minutes before, perhaps a little longer. An inference supported by the fact that it was only partly eaten. I examined the apple and found it bore marks of very irregular teeth. While you were gone, I oiled it over, and rushing down to my room, where I always keep a little plaster of Paris handy for such work, I took a mold of the part where the teeth had left the cleanest mark. Then I returned the apple to its place, for the police to use as they thought fit. Looking at my mold, it was plain to see the person who had bitten it had lost 2 teeth, one at the top and one below, not exactly opposites, but neatly so. The other teeth, although they appeared to be fairly sound, were regular in size and line. Now a dead man had, as I saw, a very excellent set of false teeth, regular and sharp, with none missing. Therefore, it was plain that someone else had been eating the apple. Do I make myself clear? Quite. Go on. There were other inferences to be made, slighter, but all pointing the same way. For instance, a man of Foggatt's age does not so much munch on an unpeeled apple like a schoolboy. Inference, a young man, and healthy. Why I came to the conclusion that he was a tall, active gymnast, or perhaps a sailor, I have already told you, when we examined the outside of Foggatt's window. It was also very clear that the robbery was not the motive, since nothing was undisturbed. There was a friendly conversation that preceded the murder. Witnessed the drinking and the eating of the apple. Whether or not the police noticed these things, I can't say. If they had, their best men would have certainly would, I think. But the case, to a rough observer, looked so clearly like an accident or suicide that possibly they didn't. As I said, after the inquest, I was unable to devote an immediate time to the case, but I resolved to keep my eyes open. The man to look for was tall, young, strong, and active, with a very irregular set of teeth. And 2 missing from the lower jaw must be left of center, and the upper a little further still towards the left. He might be a person I've seen about the premises. I have a good memory for faces, of course. And he might possibly not. Just before you returned from your holiday, I noticed a young man at Uzides whom I remembered to have seen somewhere about the offices in this building. He was a tall, young, and so on, and he had a client with me, and was unable to examine him more narrowly. Indeed, I was not exactly engaged in the case, but there are several tall young men about. I took little trouble. But today, finding the same young man with a vacant seat opposite him, I took the opportunity of making a closer acquaintance. You certainly managed to draw him out. Oh yes, the easiest person in the world to draw out is a cyclist. The easiest cyclist to draw out, of course, the novice, but the next easiest is the veteran. When you see a healthy, well-trained looking man who nevertheless has a slight stoop in his shoulders, and maybe a medal on his watch guard, it is always a safe card to try him first with a little cycle talk. I soon brought Mr. Mason out of his shell, read his name on the medal, and had a chance of observing his teeth. Indeed, he spoke of them himself. Now, as I observed just now, there are several tall, athletic young men about, and also there are several men who have lost teeth. But now I saw that this tall and athletic young man had lost exactly 2 teeth, one from the lower jaw, just from the left to the center, and the other from the upper jaw, further still toward the left. Trivialities pointing in the same direction became important considerations. More, his teeth were regularly throughout, and as nearly as I could remember, looked remarkably like the little plaster mold of mine. He produced from his pocket an irregular lump of plaster, about 3 inches long. On one side, this appeared a relief of the likeness of 2 irregular rows of teeth, or 6 or 8. minus one in each row, where a deep gap was seen, and the position spoken of by the friend. He proceeded. This was enough, at least, to set me after the young man, but he gave me the greatest chance of all when he turned and left his apple, eaten unpeeled, remember, another important triviality, on his plate. I'm afraid I wasn't at all polite, and I ran the risk of arousing his suspicions, but I couldn't resist the temptation to steal it. I did, as you saw, and here it is. He brought the apple from his coat pocket, one side bitten and placed against the upper half of the mold, fitted precisely, the projection of the apple fitting the deep gap. The other side similarly fitted the lower half. There's no getting behind that, you see, he remarked. Merely observing the man's teeth was a guide to some extent. This is plain as his signature, or his thumbprint impression. You'll never find two men bite exactly the same, no matter whether they leave distinct teeth marks or not. Here, by the by, is Miss Clayton's oil. We'll take another mold of this apple and compare them. He oiled the apple, heaped a little plaster on the newspaper, and took my water jug and rapidly pulled off a hard mold. The parts corresponding to the merely broken pieces of the apple were, of course, dissimilar. But as to the teeth marks, the impressions were identical. Oh, that will do, I think, Hewitt said. Tomorrow morning, Brett, I shall put up these things in a small parcel and take them around to Bow Street. But are they sufficient evidence? Quite sufficient for the police purpose. There is the man and all the rest. His movements on the day and so forth are simple matters of inquiry. At any rate, that is police business. I had scarcely sat down to my breakfast when the following morning, when Hewitt came into the room and put a long letter before me. From our friend of last night, he said. Read it. This letter began abruptly and updated, and as was follows. To Martin Hewitt, Esquire. Sir, I must compliment you on the adroitness you exhibited this evening in the extracting of me my name. The address I was able to balk you out of for the time being, although by the time you read this, you will probably have found it through the law list, as I am admitted scholar. That, however, will be of little use to you, for I am removing myself, I think, beyond the reach of even your abilities of search. I knew you well by sight, and was perhaps foolish to allow myself to be drawn in as I did. Still, I had no idea that it would be dangerous, especially after seeing you, as a witness with very little to say, at the inquest upon the scoundrel I shot. Your somewhat discourteous seizure of my apple at first amazed me. Indeed, I was a little doubtful as to whether you had really taken it, but it was my first warning that you might be playing a deep game against me, incomprehensible as the action was to my mind. I subsequently reflected that I had eaten that apple instead of taking the drink he had first offered me in the dead wretch's room on the night he came to his merited end. From this I assumed that your design was in some way to compare the remains of the two apples, although I do not presume to fathom the depths of your detective system. Still, I have heard of many of your cases and profoundly admire the keenness of you exhibit. I am thought to be a keen man myself, but although I was able, to some extent, to hold my own tonight, I admit that your acumen in this case is something beyond me. I do not know by whom you are commissioned to hunt me, nor to what extent you may be acquainted with my connection with the creature I killed. I have sufficient respect for you, however, to wish you that would not regard me as a vicious criminal, and a couple of hours to spare in which to offer you an explanation that may persuade you that which is not altogether the case. My hastily and violent temper I admit possessing. Even I am not to regret the one crime it has led me to, for it was, I suppose, strictly speaking, a crime. For it was the man Foggatt that made a felon of my father before the eyes of the world, and killed him with shame. It was he who murdered my mother, and nonetheless murdered her because she died of a broken heart. That he was also a thief and a hypocrite might have concerned me little. but for that. Of my father, I remembered very little. He must, I fear, have been weak and incapable man of many aspects. He had no business abilities. In fact, he was quite unable to understand the complicated business matters in which he largely dealt. Foggatt was a consummate master of all those arts of financial jugglery that make so many fortunes and ruin so many others, in matters of company, promoting stock and shares. He was unable to exercise them, however, because of great financial disaster in which he had been mixed up a few years before, and which made his name one to be avoided in future. In these circumstances, he made a sort of secret and informal partnership with my father, who, ostensibly alone in his business, acted throughout the directions of Foggatt, understanding as little of what he did, poor simple man, as a schoolboy would have done. The transactions carried on went from small to large, and unhappily from honorable to dishonorable. My father relied on the superior abilities of Foggatt with an absolute trust, carrying out each day the directions given him by the previous evening, buying, selling, and printing prospects, signing whatever had to be signed, all with the sole responsibility and a sole partner, while Foggatt, behind the scenes, absorbed the larger shares of the profits. In brief, my unhappy and foolish father was a mere tool in the hands of this cunning scoundrel who pulled all the wires of the business, himself unseen and irresponsible. At the last 3 companies, for the promotion of which my father was responsible, came to grief a heap. Fraud was written large over all their history, and while Foggatt retired to his plunder, my father was left to meet ruin, disgrace, and imprisonment. From beginning to end, he, and only he, was responsible. There was no shred of evidence to connect Foggatt with the matter, and no means to escape from the net drawn about my father. He lived through 3 years of imprisonment, and then, entirely abandoned by the man who had made use of his simplicity, he died, of nothing but shame and a broken heart. Of this I knew nothing at the time. Again and again, as a small boy, I remember asking my mother why I had no father at home, as other boys had, unconscious of the stab I thus inflicted on her gentle heart. Of her earnest, as well as my latest, memory was that of a pale, weeping woman who grudged to let me out of her sight. Little by little, I learnt the whole cause of my mother's grief, for she had no other confidant, and I fear my character developed early, for my first coherent resemblance of the matter is that of a childish design to take a table knife and kill the man who had made my father die in prison and caused my mother to cry. One thing, however, I never knew: the name of that bad man. Again and again, as I grew older, I demanded to know, but my mother always withheld it from me, with a gentle reminder that vengeance was for a greater hand than mine. I was 17 years of age when my mother died. I believe that nothing but her strong attachment to myself and her desire to keep me safe started in the life kept her alive for so long. Then I found that through all those years, by narrowed means, she had contrived to scrape and save a little money, sufficient, as it afterwards proved, to see me through my examinations for entrance in my profession, with the generous assistance of my old father's legal advisers, who gave me the articles, and who have all along treated me with extreme kindness. For the most of the succeeding years, my life had not concerned the matter at hand. I was a lawyer's clerk in my benefactor's service, and afterwards a qualified man among their assistants. All through, the firm were careful, in pursuance of my poor mother's wishes, that I should not learn the name or whereabouts of the man who wrecked her life and my father's. I first met the man himself at the Clifton Club, or had gone with an acquaintance who was a member. It was not till afterwards that I understood his curious awkwardness on that occasion. A week later I called, as I have frequently done, but the building in which your office is situated on business with a solicitor has an office on the floor above your own. On the stairs, I almost ran against Mr. Foggatt. He started and turned pale, exhibiting signs of alarm that I could not understand, and asked me if I wished to see him. "No," I replied. "I don't know where you lived here, and I'm after somebody else just now. Aren't you well?" He looked at me rather doubtfully, and said he was not very well. I met him twice or thrice after that, and on each occasion his manner grew more friendly, in a servile, flattering, and mean sort of way. The thing unpleasant enough in anybody, but doubtly and so in the intercourse of a man with another young enough to be his son. Still, of course, I treated the man civilly enough. On one occasion he asked me into his rooms to look at some rather fine picture he had lately bought, and observed casually lifting a large revolver from the mantelpiece. "You see, I'm prepared for any unwelcome visitors in my den, hee," convincing him, of course, to defer to burglars. I could not help wondering at the forced and hollow character of his laugh. As we went down the stairs together, "I think we know another pretty well, Mr. Mason, eh? And if I could do anything to advance your professional prospects, I should be glad of the chance, of course. I understand the struggles of a young professional man, hee." It was a forced laugh again, and the man spoke nervously. "I think," he added, "that if you will drop tomorrow evening, perhaps, I may have a little proposal to make. Will you?" I assented, wondering what the proposal could be. Perhaps this eccentric old gentleman was a good fellow, after all, anxious to do me a good turn, and his awkwardness was nothing but a natural delicacy of banking ices. I was not so flush of good friends as to be willing to lose one. He might be desirous of putting business in my way. I went, and was received with a cordiality that even then seemed a little over-offensive. We sat and talked for one thing and another for a long while, and I began to wonder when Mr. Foggatt was coming to the point that most interested me. Several times he invited me to drink or smoke, but long usage of athletic training has given me a taste for both, and I declined. At last he began to talk about myself. I was afraid that my professional prospects in the country were not great, but he had heard of some in the colonies, South Africa, for example. Young lawyers had brilliant opportunities. "If you'd like to go there," he said, "I've no doubt with a little capital, a clever man like you could get a very grand practice together very soon. Or you might buy a share of some good established practice. I should be glad to let you have £500, or even a little more, if that would satisfy you, and—" I stood aghast. Why should this man, almost a stranger, offer me £500 or even more, if that wouldn't satisfy me? What claim had I on him? It was very generous of him, of course, but out of the question. I was at least a gentleman, and had a gentleman's self-respect. Meanwhile, he had gone meandering on, and halting in some way, and presently let slip a sentence that struck me like a blow between the eyes. "I shouldn't like you to bear ill will because of what happened in the past," he said. Your late lamented mother, I'm afraid. She had unworthy suspicions, I'm sure. It was all for the best parties. Your father always appreciated." I sat back in my chair and stood erect before him. This groveling wretch, forcing the words through his dry lips, was a thief who had made another of my father, and had brought to miserable ends the lives of both of my parents. Everything was clear. The creature went in fear of me, never imagining that I did not know him, and sought to buy me off from remembrance of my dead mother's broken heart, for £500. £500! pound that he had made for my father to steal from him. I said not a word, but the memory of all my mother's bitter tears and savage sense of his crowning insult to myself took hold upon me, and I was a tiger. Even then, I verily believed that one word of repentance, one tone of honest remorse, would have saved him. But he drooped his eyes, sniffled excuses, and stammered of unworthy suspicions and no ill will. I let him stammer. Presently he looked up and saw my face, and fell back in his chair, sick with terror. I snatched the pistol from his mantelpiece, and thrusting in his face, shot him where he sat. My subsequent coolness and quietness surprised me now. I took my hat and stepped towards the door, but there were voices on the stairs. The door was locked on the inside, and I left it so. I went back and quietly opened the window. Below was a clear drop into darkness, and above was a plain wall. But away on one side, where the slope of the gable sprang from the roof, an iron gutter ended, supported by strong brackets. It was the only way. I got up on the sill and carefully shut the window behind me, for people were already knocking at the lobby door. From the end of the sill, holding on by the reveal of the window, with one hand, leaning and stretching my utmost, I caught the gutter, swung myself clear, and scrambled on the roof. I climbed over many roofs before I found, in an adjoining street, a ladder lashed perpendicularly against the front of the house in course of repair. This, to me, was an easy opportunity to descend, notwithstanding the bounds fastened over the face of the ladder. I availed myself of it. I have taken some time and trouble in order that you, so far as I am aware, the only human being beside myself who knows me to be the author of Foggatt's death, shall have at least the means of appraising my crime at its value of culpability. How much you already know of what I have told you I cannot guess. I am wrong, hardened and fatiguous. I make no doubt, but I speak the facts as they are. You see the thing, of course, from your own view, I from mine. As I remember my mother. Trusting that you will forgive the odd freak of a man, a criminal, let us say, who makes a confidant of the man set to hunt him down, I beg leave to be, sir, your obedient servant, Sidney Mason. I read the singular document through and handed it back to Hewitt. How does it strike you? Hewitt asked. Mason would seem to be a man of very marked character, I said. Certainly no fool. And if his tale is true, Foggatt is no great loss to the world. Just so, if the tale is true. Firstly, I'm disposed to believe it is. Where was the letter posted? It wasn't posted. It was handed in with others from the front door letterbox this morning in an unstamped envelope. He must have dropped it in himself during the night. Paper. Yep, proceeded, holding up to the light. Turkey Mill, ruled foolscap, envelope, blue official shape, Perry's watermark, both quite extraordinary, and no special marks. Where do you suppose he's gone? Impossible to guess. Some might think he meant suicide by the expression beyond the reach of even your abilities to search, but I scarcely think that he's the sort of man to do that. There is no telling. Something may be got by inquiring at his late address, of course, but when such a man tells you he doesn't think you will find him, you may count upon its being a difficult job. His opinion is not to be despised. What shall you do? Put the letter in the box with the casts for the police. Fiat justitia, you know, without any question of sentiment. Also, as to the apple, I really think, if the police will let me, I'll make a present of it. Keep it somewhere as a souvenir for absolute deficiency in the reflective observation in this case. And look to it whenever you feel yourself growing dangerously conceited. It should cure you. This is a history of the withered and almost petrified half-apple that stands in my cabinet, among a number of flint implements and one or two other fine-looking old Roman vessels. Of Mr. Sidney Mason, we never heard another word. The police did their best, but they left not a track behind him. His rooms were left almost undisturbed, and he had gone without anything in the way of elaborate preparation for his journeys, and yet without leaving a trace of his intentions.